All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for episode number 40 of our live session on the what and how around resiliency. Today, we're going to sit down with Dan Luna and Dr. Chris Frueh and discuss, building resilience as a leader and applying those skills into your organization. Today's episode is sponsored by the Talent War Group, a management consulting and executive search firm bringing talent solutions to business problems. You can find out more information at talentwargroup.com. Today's episode is also sponsored by the Forge School located in Benton, Tennessee. The Forge School is a residential treatment center for teen boys ages 13 to 17. They have 24 beds. They're for short-term stays of 45 days, and they are insurance reimbursement and private pay programs. To find out more information, you can visit them on their website at www.forgeschoolrtc.com by calling their admissions line at 866-481-4403 or visiting them on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. We want to hear from the audience as we have this discussion. So at any time, whether you're on YouTube, LinkedIn, whatever platform, if you have questions for our panel members, put them in the comments and we'll do our best to try and address them during the live session. So joining us here, we'll do some introductions. My name is Carly Walden. Again, I'm the host. I am the president and COO of Talent War Group. Joining me today, we have Dan Luna. I'll start with you, sir, for introductions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dan Luna. I'm a retired Navy SEAL. I'm a certified leadership coach. I'm also a doctoral student at USC, where I'm looking at doing my dissertation on pre-trauma curriculum. And I'm also a new position, the Resilient Warrior Fellow at the Naval Academy out of the Stockdale Center for Ethics and Leadership. Basically, I support initiatives internal to the Naval Academy and external.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today, Dan. Dr. Chris Frueh.
Hi, I'm Chris Frueh, and I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I am also a behavioral scientist. I teach at the University of Hawaii, but I also do quite a lot of work with the special operation community in a variety of capacities, and I do quite a bit of work with other high performance, high profile individuals and teams.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us today. And we have Will Sharman, who is part of the TWG team as well. Let him introduce himself.
Hi, thanks, Carly. My name is Will Sharman. I'm a content creator for Talent War Group and handle many of the different types of media that we do.
Awesome. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. This is going to be a really interesting conversation. Both Dan and Dr. Chris Frueh, your backgrounds, very relevant to the topic, and especially through the last, I guess now it's been a year and a half. It doesn't quite feel like that with COVID, right? And people finding methods for coping and being resilient in the workplace and getting through this pandemic. Just one of many topics that we'll discuss today. But I think a really good place to start here is understanding what resilience is and what does it mean to you. So I'll leave it to the floor, whoever wants to answer that question first.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go first. So I guess just for big picture, there's a lot of content and information out there right now on resilience. So what the intent for Chris and I is to not just regurgitate a lot of the information that's out there, but really just start at a macro level and work down from there on how these principles and themes can then show up in your personal life, in your team, and in your organization. So speaking of themes, a standard definition of resilience is essentially positively adaptation or an ability to thrive in the face of adversity. And so what I've noticed with my research and being in multiple workshops in the corporate sector is there's these three themes of either stress, rest, or time. And when I say stress, really the work component, the toughness component. And so even Carly, as you described it, you said, hey, somebody's ability to be resilient and then cope. And so that coping, how I categorize that in this frame is the rest component. So, hey, when you're not going through a stressful event, what are you doing afterwards? And then there's a time component. So a before, a during, and an after. And I really like painting these themes. So as I work with clients and as I present framework, then especially because there's so many definitions of resilience out there, and it means something different even to organizations, and there's policies and procedures around it. They're able to distill it down through frames to then better make decisions for themselves, their team, and the organization. So that frame that I like to use, those three big themes, is either stress, rest, or a time component. And the time component is, hey, what's the lead up? How long is the work or the stress activity? And then how long is that recovery period? So time's a constant factor. And I'll just pause there.
Well, Dan, let me ask you this question, because I think you touched on something that is kind of a pet peeve of mine, which is the multiple definitions of resilience. So part of what I say to people when we talk about resilience is I always say, well, what is it? What even is it? And can we all agree on what it is? And I think in part we don't agree on what it is. And so when we use the term resilience, we may be meaning wildly different things from each other. So just for example, in your definition, I think there was, what I heard was, maybe you didn't say this, but maybe there's an implied sense of adversity initially has an effect, knocks us down, thwarts us, stalls us, whatever, and then we come back, and we come back strong, and we come back hard, and we're functioning better. Is that resilience, or is resilience maybe never being knocked down in the first place? In which case, then I start to wonder, well, is resilience the same thing as hardiness? And what's the difference between the two? So maybe just to kind of set the tone for the rest of our conversation, you could speak to that issue, Dan. Resilience versus hardiness. What's the difference?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I love that. So often when I hear about resilience, and there's literature on this too, there's overlap between resilience, hardiness, and grit. And so typically with resilience, it is that big theme is adaptability. So that's the common theme as I've looked at multiple definitions. There's a positive adaptability component to make it through adversity. With hardiness, it typically is one's ability to endure over time. Oh, they're so hardy. So that endurance component and the time component. And then grit is typically focuses on preserving towards a long-term goal. So, hey, you have this goal. Hey, there's this grittiness that knock down, get back up, and you're going to continue forward. And so even in those brief definitions that I said in resilience, hardiness, and grit, you can see where that overlap is. And what's interesting is there's one word, and it's a theoretical frame of perseverance. So if you really pull apart perseverance in three other components, there's resiliency, grit, and hardiness.
And I would argue, given your definition of resilience, that there's probably not just simply one component to it. There's probably multiple components. So that overlap with with hardiness and with grit. There's probably some other things in there. You want to take a minute just to unpack some of those other elements?
Yeah. So one, this isn't Dan Luna's definition. What this is Dan Luna's distilled from literature.
No, I want Dan Luna's definition
of multiple.
What
I like working in themes, Chris, and you know
I know, but you got to define your themes. So let's hear it.
I don't have to. So that's why, and that's the coaching component. And so how things show up for people is different. And so if I'm working with, and there's a lot of people that do work specific to resilience, and they'll talk about capacity, individual capacity, team capacity, organizational capacity. And they'll look at, what I've seen is it tends to lean towards either the toughness side or the work or advert, like, hey, we got to be stronger and tougher, or it leans towards the rest and recovery and the wellness side. And when I work with groups, I don't necessarily like using the word balance, because it'll be misinterpreted as in, hey, the work and the rest need to be equal. And that's not my decision to make for that individual or organization. So it's on them. So there's some folks who, hey, we work all day and we only have a 4-hour break. So where I would work with them, do they need to be tougher? Probably not. Where they could really like use some help is like, hey, in that 4-hour period, what are you trying to do? I'm assuming you're probably trying to sleep. Yeah, we're trying to sleep. Okay. So now let's talk about the rest. So in that 4-hour period, how can we maximize that rest? And there's a time component. So that time component shows up. So that's why I like using things in themes, because it's a formula that's also a resilient formula that's adaptable.
So, gentlemen, in the LinkedIn chat, we had Dr. Stephen Horsley, and apologize if I mispronounced your name, but resilience seems, very complicated as we just get into the conversation here. But he's asking, can we simply define resilience as the ability to overcome challenges?
So Steve, thanks for jumping on here. I know Dr. Horsley, and he has done a ton of work with resilience. And I agree, like, hey, can we agree on that? Yes, 100%. And there's organizations that define it differently. And typically, once again, I go back to the themes. What I've seen is it tends to lean on one side of either the toughness, or it leans on the other side of wellness. When I do work with resiliency, I'll use within my best judgment, and I'll work with the organization to see where the gap is, and then how to best support them in how they define it through either through their policy or their personal definition. And yes, I totally agree, the ability to overcome challenge.
So, question for both of you: what is resilience not? What is not resilience? Like, when does it become harmful, right? Like, yes, if you're in an organization, you want people who are resilient, they're adaptable to different situations and to be able to overcome those obstacles and challenges. But when can you be too resilient? Or does that make sense?
Chris, are you okay if I start this off?
Yeah, go for it, Dan.
So what I think you're asking, Carly, is essentially burnout.
Yeah.
And I've worked with a lot of clients in this, where I'm working with them or their teams, and they're talking about, we need to be more resilient and tougher. And it's just like, actually, and I like using this analogy of working out. And so, hey, if I go into the gym and I lift for an hour, what am I doing for the other 23 hours? There's a nutrition component. There's a sleep component. There's these other components that also play into my workout. And it goes into recovery. So, and I think that's where, not the confusion, where it becomes a multidimensional characteristic of resilience. So, hey, very simply, I agree with Dr. Horsley. Hey, we can define it as simply define resilience, the ability to overcome challenges, 100%. And then as we dig into it, there's that before component. Hey, what are you doing before the event or before work or before the stress? And then during, how do you handle it? How do you self-regulate? How do you think about it? How do you frame it? And then afterwards, how do you cope? How do you come back down? How do you go reach a normal level? And I'll pause there. I'm curious as your thoughts, Chris.
What I hear you saying, Dan, is behaviors before, during, and after are markers of resilience, or they're elements of resilience, as well as cognitive mindset, how we frame things, how we understand things, how we talk to ourselves, how we talk to others. So that mindset before, during, and after also critically important. How about some individual qualities, maybe stemming from personality styles? We know that personality and a lot of our emotional and cognitive makeup has a strong genetic aspect to it. So I think we could talk about kind of where is somebody on the resilience spectrum, however we define that. And maybe we just say, let's define it as measured by something like one of the resilience scales out there, like the Connor-Davidson resilience scale, for example. So let's say we measure that. We can get a number. Your resilience is X. Will's resilience is Y. Mine is Z. And Carly's is probably off the scale higher than all of us put together. So if we can know that, that's at an individual level. But I think there's also a contextual element, like different contexts. We might not all perform well in the same situations or contexts, and a team or organizational aspect to it. So I think of, and we talked about this, over the last few days, you could have a resilient individual, but you can also have a team or a unit or an organization that has a culture of resilience. And what does that look like? And how does that affect maybe the individuals who are less resilient, but still a part of that team? What do you think about any of that?
Yeah, I love it. I love you, Chris. So everything you say, I'm just like soaking it in and taking in notes. What I'd also add to it, and that's why I like the themes. So there's the internal self, so the cognitive, yes, the emotional self, and which also plays into the physical self. So the mind, body, where people hold stress, how it affects them physically. And then there's the external, so their behaviors, and then the culture and the environment that they're in. So all those things can affect it and affect the individual positively in a positive or negative way. Where I think is a great start, one is this conversation. So for an individual, I'm a big fan of inside out leadership. So leadership starts with you. So for an individual to start asking themselves questions, hey, how am I, and for simply like, hey, how do I handle stress? How adaptable am I? Do I have a positive outlook at the future? And I'm looking at some of the chat here. Getting back up after getting down mentally or physically, know and believe things will be better tomorrow. Yeah, 100%. So now to have a positive outlook on the future and to know that, hey, I'm knocked down, but it's not going to stop me and I'm going to get back up. And that almost goes back to what you were mentioning earlier about the burnout. Hey, that's great to get back up and also recognize it's okay to take a break. It's okay to rest. And I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there right now that's just like grind, go, be tough, and be stronger.
Never quit.
Never quit. And that's great. And like, you got to sleep, you have to eat, you have to spend time outside, like spend time with loved ones. Like there's that other side to life.
So 100% agree. And that's a nice segue into my brother Eric Gray's question about how long we should keep going. How long should we keep pushing? How long should we maintain that never quit attitude? But maybe things aren't working out. Maybe there's a point at which you say, okay, this idea, this effort, this project, this relationship even isn't going to work. Or it's not going to work the way I thought it would or wanted it to. At what point do we go, okay, no mas? At what point do we step away? Or what point do we pivot and change directions. And how do we fit that in with resilience? And maybe that's another way we can be too resilient.
What about like setting boundaries, right? Whether that's safeguarding your time, whether that's to step outside of work, or it's to, Dan, you and I have had several conversations around this of different methods of coming more or less back to center, and like whether that is exercising or that's you have some kind of ritual, whether it's meditation, but you're setting those boundaries.
So a couple of thoughts. So Chris, with what you said, I was thinking of the sunk cost bias. So where you invest in something, you're like, oh, it's got to go, it's got to go. And so really when hey, Carly, I think you're off mute. If you just hit mute. So I'm thinking about the sunk cost bias on that. And that's a great question that the individual or the team or the organization needs to answer. So starting out with asking questions. So even just having a conversation. So, hey, and I don't want to go too far ahead into the how, but part of the how is to ask yourself questions. I'm like, hey, how do these things show up? And to have that dialogue either with yourself through self-reflection or through the team, the organization. Carly, with what you mentioned with boundaries, I was thinking, yes, and a practice. Hey, what is your resilient practice? So how does adaptability show up? And out of all the things, where does persistence show up? And for some people, that toughness, hey, I need to be tougher. Yes. What are you doing to push yourself? And for some individuals, there needs to be the focus on, hey, you're not doing anything, like go out and do something, push yourself, like go do something and work on being tougher. For other folks that are working 18 hours, they probably don't need to be tougher. Hey, what are you doing to relax? And so that emotional and cognitive control under pressure while you're in it, what does that look like? So there is that multi-dimensional component to it. And I want to give you some time to talk about this as well, Chris.
Well, so I was going to chime in and say, we can be super resilient, which can look like but it could also look like insanity. So if I decide, hey, you know what? If I just work hard, I can get to play in the major leagues. I can get to be center fielder for the New York Yankees. If I just work hard. So I'm going to go out and start running and lifting and training and playing with a baseball and baseball bat. I'm going to work really hard and think at some point in the future, I'm going to get there and I'm going to be a star. Is that realistic for me? Absolutely not. It's absolutely not realistic. Like, I'm too old. I don't have the genetic makeup. I never was that good at hitting a fastball, and on and on and on. So the question becomes, at what point do you have to say, let's reevaluate goals? And for me, part of that is setting goals, not just the distant goal, but the more proximal, more immediate goals, and a time frame. So when Carly talks about boundaries, the first thing I thought of is time frame and deadlines to kind of put a bound on what you're trying to do and how long you're going to be doing it, and assessing whether you're doing it well.
Since we're kind of talking about it, I wouldn't mind speaking about goals just a little bit more. So I totally agree with what you just said, Chris. And there's a lot of goal matrices out there. Once again, like what I don't want to do in this setting is regurgitate things that's already out there. From working with clients, what I've noticed is not just the typical goal setting, but like, hey, just focusing in. So I wrote a guided journal. All my clients journal. Everyone journals. And it's a key part is to be internal and reflective and just to notice. And we'll do noticing exercises. Hey, as you're in a stressful environment or you're going through the day, what do you notice? What do you notice where your mind is at? What do you notice? What is your body doing? I'll ask somatic questions or body questions. Do you notice your heart racing? Do you notice you're sitting a certain way or your pace picks up or how you walk? through the office. And then after work, how do you notice? How do you come back down, or do you just stay revved up the whole time? And so it's really just noticing, and then after noticing and observing, hey, what's a small step and what's a really small goal? And we'll set small goals or a small step, and I'll ask them, hey, what's a small step look like? And it might be a frame. I use narrative, so the story. Hey, what story? Hey, can we shift that? Do you want to work on that? Hey, there's that internal voice. What's another voice that can show up to shift from maybe something negative to positive? And we'll start naming these things. So as they're going through the day, they're like, oh, there's that. That's my way of thinking. That's my current frame. Hey, I want to shift it to this frame. So we'll reframe. So wherever they want to go. And then just the last two things, commit to something specific. And like, hey, specific, the day, the time, what you're going to do, the activity. So commit to something specific. And then the last thing is look for the win. And I've worked with so many folks and that they'll get down on themselves because a lot of them are high performers. So they're like, I suck at this, or I'm not doing this well. And it's just like, hey, you have a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the world, and you have a lot going on in your life. So show yourself some grace. And they're just like blown away that this Navy SEAL just got them, just told them like, hey, it's okay. Hey, there are setbacks. Look for the small win. Hey, you're thinking about it. Hey, you did 2 days of this. So look for that win so you don't get down on yourself.
And I would add to that, it's really easy for somebody. I think there's a trap here for the high performer. Let's call it the high performer trap. You were super successful as a Navy SEAL, or other people have been super successful as a Green Beret, or as a scientist, or as a therapist, or as business person in one context. And that can set us up for the trap, though, I fear, of going, well, I was super successful in this phase of my life. Now it must be preordained I will be super successful in every other phase of my life. And that's not necessarily going to be realistic in all cases. So I think just because you're good in one, just because you're outstanding in one area doesn't mean you'll be outstanding in every area. And I think part of what this requires is having an honest conversation with yourself and with other people around you about what's realistic, what are some of your blind spots, what do you need work on. And I guess this is going back to Eric's question of how do you know when it's time to say, well, this isn't going the way it needs to. So I'm either going to do something else, or I'm going to pivot and adapt in some way. I do like to think about some of the other aspects of resilience. Things like having a mindset of being open to failure. I think being open to failure is a really important aspect of resilience, and understanding that failure is a part of life. It is going to happen. I think you can develop that mindset a little bit with practice, with coaching. And I think it will help you be resilient and help you switch directions when you need to. Developing that mindset that failure is a learning experience. I guess that's probably the way I want to put it, that failure is a learning experience that we have to be open to. We have to be receptive to that. No shame in failure.
What I'd like to do is also add our ability to cope with events influence both successful and unsuccessful adaptations. And what you just said too, Chris, is if we're resilient, we may be resilient in our professional life, and in our personal life, we may not be as resilient. And that's a real, yeah. And so that's just something, and that's why I love asking questions, and for somebody to journal and reflect on this information, and they can ask themselves like, oh man, I'm great at work, and when I go home, man, if this goes off the rails, like I'm done.
So part of what you're saying there, and I agree with, is we can be resilient in one area, but not in another area. And it's important for an individual to kind of develop that self-awareness. But also, if we're saying that there are different aspects or multiple components of resilience, we're probably not all going to be resilient in the same ways. So I think we could ask ourselves, where am I resilient in my life? Where am I less resilient? And in what ways am I resilient? And in what ways am I not resilient? Because that becomes a place for development. So I think that the journaling and working with a coach can be very useful. So let's take it to a team level now. What most of our discussion so far has been about individuals. How can a team be more resilient? And I have some thoughts on that, but I thought I'd flip it back to you, Dan and Carly, to maybe get us started on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dan, again, we've talked about this multiple times, and you've actually discussed certain organizations actually having resilience policies in place. I want to hear more about that and share that with the audience.
I'm curious about that too.
Yeah, so for example, FEMA, right? So if you think about the role of FEMA, it makes sense for them to have a resilient policy. And so FEMA, they define it, and how, I don't know off the top of my head, I don't remember, but how they define it is the guiding light for the organization. So as these conversations come up, and in the beginning, as we talked about multiple definitions, hey, that's great, how I see it, how different literature says that it's defined, your organization may have a policy. Either way, I think it's great that an organization has a policy around it and is aware, especially with stress in the workplace. And a lot of my work on trauma prevention and curriculum, a lot of my work is working with organizations primarily on the mental health side. Hey, what are things that the organization can incorporate to better support its teammates, its employees? And it's a great conversation to have, because peer support, I'll just pick one. And I think Chris, you mentioned it earlier. I think peer support is probably the biggest one. So you can do time in nature and all these other things and go home and have this practice. If you show up to work and if you have a team that just crushes you on a mental and emotional level, and it's a toxic team, and I'll use that word loosely right now, man, that's crushing. And that can crush someone's spirit. And so to have a team that is aware and has the conversation and looks at, hey, how can we support our teammates while we're in a pandemic, while people are working from home and doing homeschooling, while we're doing all these different things and adjusting to this time as a team, how can we adapt and support each other?
That's really cool. I guess my question there is, does every organization need a policy around resilience? Or there specific industries or anything like that where you think that an organization would benefit from that type of policy?
Chris, do you have some thoughts on that? Or
my only thought, I'm staying silent because I never really heard of an organization with a resilience policy. I think it's interesting. I'd be curious to read some of those. So I'm ignorant about this, other than my only thought is, seems like it would be difficult to have a policy around resilience that would be relevant and that would be clear and relevant to everyone within the organization. But I stand to be educated.
Well, I don't know if I can fully educate you on this one. What I would say is, to whatever the organizations that are listening, is that's a great question for them to ask. And that's not for me to weasel out of this question. It's simply like the coach. Hey, it's up to that organization if they deem it necessary. I think in these times, when you look at the rise in mental health, to me, it absolutely makes sense to even have awareness around it, and to make it part of, hey, when you look at corporate social responsibility and things external of the organization, well, internally, how is the organization taking care of its people? And it can be like pool tables and jukeboxes and whatever else an organization wants to do to boost morale. But as far as stress and work hours and other opportunities, coaching, access to a psychologist, access to events and knowledge and training, Because to me, it comes down to practice. What are you practicing? So when I work with leaders, hey, as a leader, what are you consciously practicing right now? What is important to you? And so as I work with my clients, a lot of that conversation goes to stress.
Could you say more about practice, Dan? What do you mean by practice? And
So
you can then link that to stress that you were starting to talk.
Yeah, so often there's leadership workshops. Like, hey, when was the last time you did leader development? Oh, my company, or I went to this thing and it was a week long. And, every year we go to this week-long conference on leader development. Like, okay, that's great. Now let's put that in a physical context. Let's say I wanted to get better at lacrosse. And if I did a week-long tournament or workshop in lacrosse and I didn't touch it again, or maybe I took a couple of things and every now and then I'm like, oh yeah, I learned this thing in this workshop. How good do you think I would be? At a performance level, how well do you think I'd be able to perform at that? Probably not very good if I just took one thing. So a lot of times I just work with leaders on being more conscious in their practice, on their communication. So whatever direction they want to go, but we're working on something specific. Typically we'll start out with themselves and we'll start out with, hey, what's your morning routine look like? What's your evening routine look like? What's your sleep pattern look like? Because if those things are a mess, how you show up to work, fatigue is a common thing for errors. So how do we reduce errors? People love talking about high performance. Okay, let's just stop making common mistakes. And what are some things that we can implement within your daily routines and start practicing to get better at, to move in a direction that you want to move in?
And we're getting some nice comments and some nice discussion in the chat room here. And so I think being reminded that being resilient doesn't always mean being tough in the traditional sense, or even hardy in the traditional sense. So we've got comments reminding us that it can be resilient to be vulnerable, to admit your limitations, to be aware of blind spots or biases that you may have, to be things like curious and what's the humble, the opposite of arrogance, humble. I think humbleness and curiosity are two great resiliency traits that you certainly can have at the individual level, but also I think within a group, within a unit. And I think so there's very much a cultural thing that happens within groups of people. There's the old saying that if you hang around 5 people who are self-confident, you become the 6th. You hang around 5 people who are really good problem solvers, you become the 6th. I mean, we've all heard those kinds of things, but there is some truth to that. Don't you think that resilience can be a little bit even contagious just from being around other people who are functioning in a resilient way can kind of lift an individual within that group?
So now what I'm starting to hear is we're starting to move more towards the rest component, right? So those big 3 themes that I mentioned earlier, that stress or that work or that toughness, or some component of rest or bounce back, and then that time component. So now we're starting to talk about like, hey, what's the rest look like? And so that goes into the practice. Hey, so if we incorporate a practice of meditation, right? That's a common way, or breath work. And I like to separate them out, and even those two are big rabbit holes on their own. So with the rest component, what I like asking people is, what makes you feel alive? What gives you aliveness? And so incorporating that practice of what energizes you. Are you introverted? Are you extroverted? Being around a bunch of people, does that, like in support group? For me, as an introvert, man, I love being alone, and I'll take power naps. So if I have a long day, and I'll just feel that energy if I have multiple calls. So for me, I have an app on my phone. I pull it up, I do a 15-minute power nap, and I wake up from power nap and I'm good to go. So just having that self-awareness of, hey, what brings you back to life? Also, now you're doing the prep work. So when you go through an adverse situation, you're more likely to positively make it through. hey, I know in the future I've made it through a bunch of terrible things in the past. I know I'll be fine going through this event.
So right there, critically important point, and I just want to emphasize is, and we could call it stress inoculation, we could call it stress exposures, but what you just said, I think, Dan, is part of, it has to be part of this equation, which is you can't really be resilient in the abstract. You have to go through these moments of adversity and stress. And I'm thinking of kind of younger people who are protected more than they used to be from adversity and stress by parents and adults around them, schools. I think that unless we give people the chance to actually face the adversity, to feel it, to experience it, and to struggle with the consequences, which might include failures, that's a really important component of the development of resilience at the individual or the group level. So I would put training and practice, yes, but also stress inoculation or exposure to actual adversities has to be part of this.
So how I tie that in is the experiential experience. So everyday life, there's that experience that happens. There's some event, somebody cuts you off. That's a moment to practice. And it starts with noticing, hey, this is a moment in time to where I can get pissed off and allow that emotion and allow these thoughts. And it's a moment in time to where I can actually practice. If I'm getting ready to give a presentation to a company or give a presentation to my team, and if speaking in front of a large group and I feel like, oh, I'm starting to sweat or I'm doing this and my pace, like that's a moment to practice. So everyday life, there's moments where stress shows up, and it starts out with noticing it. And then like, oh, wow, I notice I do this. Okay, so does that mean that you're going to start doing breath work? And that's where the goal orientation starts to happen after noticing and observing and tying in that practice to the experiences that you have in everyday life.
But both from an organizational perspective, let's say I'm the Department of Defense, and I want to train you, Dan, and send you overseas to do some dangerous work in a war zone. I'm not just going to show you a PowerPoint on how a rifle works and then send you over there with a rifle, right? We're going to practice. You're going to have not just practice, but you're going to get coaching. And eventually that training is going to mean, okay, now let's see how you do with the basic skills, but under a little more pressure. So live fire drills, contextual situations like close quarters training and things like that, where you're having to actually not just use your skills under kind of a very relaxed, quiet, general situation, but you actually have to use them where the situation is more stressful, more fluid, more dynamic and unpredictable. And I think it's that practice is really critical, both at the individual and the team level, for taking all of these skills and developing them so that we can use them when we need them most.
So I don't want to nerd out too much on this one.
Please nerd out.
What I will say is, and this is even some of the work that I'm doing, is like anything else in education, it's scaffold. Hey, we're going to start out with the alphabet. And then from the alphabet, we're going to go into, bigger words and then put sentences together. And then over time, we're going to, do amazing writing. So it happens over time, and it's scaffold. And so when you start getting into stress inoculation, I actually think that's a big component that's missing. And so the individual needs to do their work first. So to look at how they frame things, the stories, once again, I just use narrative. So the stories that they tell themselves, the songs that they repeat, so what they repeat constantly, and then how they deal with it within their nervous system. So how does that show up? Are they always on? Are they able to deregulate themselves? So I think it needs to start with the individual first, and we're really good at the physical. we're really good at like, hey, here's a gun and here's how you use it, and here's combat and here's these things. And we're good at the physical. And I don't think we're so good at the non-physical, so the invisible component. And then working with individuals to self-regulate with all the components that's involved in that, to include spirituality. And I know that's even like a taboo thing to say, but for so many people, they ground themselves in their faith, and it's even in the literature. So to ground yourself in something
Absolutely.
bigger, and then from there work to the team, and then from the team level, and then work to the organizational level. And there's a long time component, and I think that's a big piece missing prior to showing, or whatever the stress inoculation training looks like, and then moving on to whatever the volatility looks like, or those adverse events, or in extremis, whatever language you want to use. But I think there's a long workup process. And I think because we're not, so really my theory right now is we're not doing this long workup process. And now you have a lot of the mental, or part of the contributing factor,
Yes.
or all the mental health issues that we're seeing with veterans.
And I think as a society, just to maybe put a punctuation on what you just said, I think as a society, we are not doing enough practice and exposure at the pre-adversity point. So you started off today by introducing concept of pre-traumatic coaching. And that's where I think a lot of our society, we're letting ourselves down, is by not having sufficient pre-adversity preparation.
Yeah,
Well, I don't think anyone is immune from, like, there's not someone that doesn't need resilience. No one's immune. I think Scott Pressfield has a quote about this where he says, no industry is immune and no occupation is safe. All of us need to begin to think in terms of our own inner strengths, our resilience and resourcefulness, our capacity to adapt and to rely upon ourselves and our families.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
You know, confidence, self-efficacy, empowerment. Yes, yes, yes to all of that. And I think a great place to start is like, hey, do you react or do you respond? And the distinction is, you know, are you consciously aware? Are you trained? Have you put in the work? Or is things just happening and you're like, this is what I'm going to do. And so you're reactive vice responding. Hey, I've put in the time, I've practiced, I've done breath work, I know grounding techniques, I know myself, I know how to recharge, I have a positive outlook on the future, I have people that will support me, I have all these things, I'm grounded in something bigger than me, in this spirituality or whatever it is. And so to do that upfront work is, and it's hard, but to do the upfront work, I think, and Chris, I think you agree with me.
Yes, it makes all the difference. And the upfront work,
difference.
That upfront work may not be something you chose. It may be something that chose you, life circumstances and adversities. But I think whatever we can do to prepare for those is critically important. And I know we're just about out of time. I want to add one word to, you talked about spirituality and you mentioned meaning. I think meaning is super important. Meaning and purpose in life. And when we have that, when we have a sense of where we want to go and what we're trying to do and why, I think that elevates our resiliency just right off the bat, just having that. And that can exist at the individual level or at the unit level, team level.
Gentlemen, I think we could go on for hours on this topic and have an engaging conversation. But as we begin to lead out here, what are, Dan and Dr. Chris Frueh, what are just the key takeaways for the audience, like that you want them to take and go and apply in their own personal and professional lives?
I would say start with the awareness that resilience is not a simple sentence. It's a complex concept with multiple domains, probably. And it's probably, I think we could probably all agree, it's somewhat fluid across situations, across days even, or across times within an individual. And so we could think of it also at the individual level and the team level. And I'll kick it over to Dan because I know he'll talk about his themes and the 5 components of behavior, thoughts, feelings.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about them, but I will. Honestly, what I was thinking was just what do and I'm just talking generally to the audience, what do you need right now? And for some people, they might need to be tougher. So what does that look like? And how can toughness how can you push yourself more in your life? And if it's on the other side of the spectrum, if you're like, man, I work these long hours and I grind and I do this thing, like, okay, well, what makes you feel alive? What recharges your battery? What are those things that maybe you're doing outside of work that maybe probably not helping yourself out? And how can you move that energy to something else that can help yourself out? So just start with asking yourself what questions. Stay away from why questions. I won't get into that, but just ask yourself what questions. And then at the end of that, what does the next step look like? And what is a small goal that you can set? And then remember to look for those wins and show yourself grace. Just keep moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you, gentlemen. So as we had mentioned in the beginning of the live session, we have Will Sharman on, who is our junior contributor for this session. So we absolutely embrace our young leaders, and hopefully they are learning from our mistakes, our failures, our successes. So Will, you've been taking all of this in. What are your top takeaways from the conversation today?
Yeah, there was a lot of great things said today. And as you said, Carly, this is a big topic that we could get into for a while. One of the things in the beginning that we talked about, resiliency versus hardiness, I thought that was interesting because, like you said, resiliency has this component of adaptability. It's multidimensional. It's about for your task, which kind of went into what Dan was talking about. Be aware of what makes you feel alive, what actually energizes you. And then another thing was the societal pressure to grind, was to never quit. And but you need rest, you need nutrition, and as Dan said, you need sunlight. Some people need to ask themselves, how can they be tougher? How are they comfortable with what's uncomfortable? And then on the other side of that coin, a lot of people need to ask themselves, what are they doing for rest? And I think that's just comes back to being reflective. And another big thing that stuck with me was, being open to failure, which kind of also relates to being reflective and being receptive. Resiliency doesn't mean that you never fail, that you don't hit your barriers, but it means that you learn from them, and it's about how you recover in the pursuit of in the pursuit of your long-term goals.
That was an awesome recap, Will. Thank you for that. So to the audience, both Mr. Dan Luna and Dr. Chris Frueh are part of our leadership collective. So if you are interested in potentially bringing them into your organization to speak, feel free to visit our website at www.talentwargroup.com to be able to book them for an engagement at your organization. So our next session for episode 41 is going to be a continued conversation of readership in leadership part 2 from the authors of the Talent War book, Mr. Mike Sorelli and Mr. George Randall. So that's going to be next Wednesday, June 23rd at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you'd like to hear more about our content, feel free to engage with us. Hopefully we answered all of your questions here today. If not, connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to continue the conversation. And if you think that this has been helpful for you, share our posts. Maybe someone else will find them just as helpful. We have 2 podcasts that I'd like to call out. First is the Jedbird podcast with our host, Fran Ricopi, Rachopi, excuse me, Rachopi. He's going to hold another conversation, another prominent conversation. He's had guests on there, such as the CEO of Jersey Mike's, Olympic gold medalist Lauren Wilkinson, and the Boston Red Sox second baseman and broadcaster Jerry Remy, and more. And lastly, just launched a few weeks ago, we have the Talent War podcast with George Randall and Tom Lokar, where they will teach you how to develop a talent mindset as they have unraveled how to transform any organization, regardless of industry, through talent. Thank you again, everyone, so much for your time. We look forward to seeing you on these live sessions again soon.